Hi everybody, welcome to Great Books, Big Ideas. My name's Jim. I thank you for joining me. I have a Proust update for you. I finished volume 3 of In Search of Lost Time. This is my reread of Proust's fictional epic. The first time through, I did the C.K. Scott Moncrieff classic translation of it. And it took me many years to read it. Probably like 10 years if you count up all the years together, off and on reading. This time I'm doing all of Proust in 1 year. So I just completed the Guermantes Way. And this is the Penguin Classics Deluxe edition. I love these covers. Hopefully you're picking up on that kind of foil look on that design. This translation is by Mark Treharne, and in Search of Lost Time, newer translations by Penguin, they each volume in the novel is by a different translator. I would like to share with you a brief review of the book, but mainly an impressionistic review. Like, these are my impressions on reading this translation. And I want to do something I've done for the first 2 volumes, which is compare this newer translation to the classic translation by C.K. Scott Moncrieff. And first, let me talk about my first experience of reading the C.K. Scott Moncrieff, which was not in this particular edition. This is the Penguin cloth-bound classic edition of the C.K. Scott Moncrieff. I believe I read it. It was the Random House hardcover edition, a 2-volume set of Remembrance of Things Past, which is what C.K. Scott Moncrieff translates as the title of the novel. But the Guermantes Way was the toughest slog of all the there in the set of books, like, for me. I think it's the longest book, and there are lots of spots where I got bogged down. And I'll explain as we go through the synopsis some of the points where I got bogged down and why. I will say that in this Mark Treharne translation that I didn't feel bogged down at all. I kept myself to a pretty strict 15 to 20 pages a day regimen. There were a few days I took off here and there, but pretty much did it at that pace, got through the whole, it was like something like 589 pages of novel. And it took me a little while, but I got through it. And I never felt like I was bogged down. There were slower patches. And then there's some super fine writing and very moving passages in this book. But this is like the big hump, I think, to get through if you're making your way through In Search of Lost Time. I feel like it's downhill from here in terms of like easier going, especially the final 3 volumes. Anyway, let me give you a synopsis. So what I like about these editions, in addition to the fact that they're trying to do a fresher, more modern translation, although you may not be able to improve on C.K. Scott Moncrieff, we'll look at that in a second. I like the format. We have the French flaps. We have deckled edges, and we have notes, which helps quite a bit with all the French culture references. Super helpful, and a very handy synopsis. So I'm going to just go through some of the highlights of that synopsis by way of just orienting us to the plot of this novel, to the extent that it has a plot. Okay, so the synopsis. The first setting is in Guermantes Way, is in Paris. So the narrator's family has moved to an apartment in a wing of the Hôtel de Guermantes. The Guermantes are this aristocratic family that our narrator idolizes and wants to get closer to. And so we have him kind of getting oriented to this new home. And then there's a scene where we go to the opera, and he sees a performance of La Burma, who appeared in an earlier volume. I think it was volume 2. And then we get his new impressions of her performing an act from Phèdre, which is, I think, the Jean Racine play. And maybe it was turned into an opera by somebody. Anyway, a musical version, I'm not sure. But anyway, he has kind of like renewed reactions to it. And one important moment in this plot has to do with the Duchess de Guermantes, who is, in a way, the narrator's new crush. She acknowledges him. It's like she arrives at her box at the theater, and she acknowledges the narrator, smiles at him, and that, kind of gives him a big lift. That's a big deal. And then our narrator, just like he was in Volume 2 in The Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, where he's a little bit of a stalker, a creep, like where he likes to follow the girls around, and he makes himself available, pretending like it's just coincidence that he showed up at the same time. He was that way with Gilberte, and then he was that way with the gang of girls, one of whom is Albertine, who will become his girlfriend, and she becomes. They start this relationship actually in this book, but now he's getting that way with the Duchess de Guermantes. He's like kind of makes sure he tries to pass by her every day on the street and so forth, and then there's like a scene where his friendship with Saint-Loup is explored in a lot of detail, and Saint-Loup is in the military, right? And the narrator hangs out with him and his friends, and there's a lot of discussions about military strategy and like the military life and so forth. And then he's called back to Paris because his grandmother has taken ill, and this is a big subplot in this volume, is the grandmother's illness and ultimate death, which is very touchingly described. Some of the most beautiful writing you'll ever find about that subject, in my opinion. Okay, so there's a lot in here about Saint-Loup and his girlfriend, who's a former prostitute, and they have a lot of relationship problems. It's hot and cold, and there's lots and lots of scenes in the book of soirees or meetings of the salons of different aristocrats. So one such scene is Madame de Villeparisis. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but she is kind of on the social decline, but she has this she's hosting all these people, and then there's so many character studies of different characters, new characters we've seen before. The narrator's friend Bloch, who is a Jew, but he's very kind of uncouth and doesn't have the right manners. There's a lot of subtext and themes here about anti-Semitism amongst the aristocracy and others, and within the bourgeoisie. And also the Dreyfus affair is a big subtext, which keeps coming up throughout the plot of this book. But these are the parts that slowed me down, were like these sort of endless studies of the minutiae of the social graces and the faux pas and all that amongst these aristocrats. It's hard to keep all the names straight, especially the first time through. I'm doing a lot better the second time through, now that I'm more familiar with the characters. But it's quite a challenge because it's very microscopic in the way that Proust is describing all these social dynamics. Also, a big character that's emerging is the Baron de Charles. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he is, I guess he's the brother of, is he a brother of the Duchess or the Duke? But he's related to the Guermantes, and he is a larger than life, sort of chaotic character, And he also provides some comic relief, but he's kind of a dangerous type. You know, he's you don't want to get on his bad side, and he's very unstable. So there's a lot about him in here. There's a lot of reflections about art and literature, as usual, in Proust. And then memories and more about their friendship with Saint-Loup. And there's a very, very long set piece where the Duchess de Guermantes is hosting another soiree, the dinner, and just, again, endless microscopic analysis of all these characters. And what's striking is the ambivalence of Proust and his narrator to all that. Because on the one hand, he idolizes these aristocrats. He wants to suck up to them. And these people, by and large, are total snobs. And he sort of wants that. Even when his attraction to the Duchess wanes, he still is sort of involved in that circle. And it's a big deal, all this social climbing and who knows who, and you know, like the royalty, who knows the royalty, and all the inbreeding and interconnections between all these folks. So on the one hand, he idolizes them, but on the other hand, he's critical of them. And through all these microscopic descriptions, he's really satirizing to the point, sometimes to the point of satire. There's a lot more comedy I'm picking up in these newer translations. Just the fools that these people can be. But they're not, it's not purely one or the other. So they're very well-rounded character types. And in the middle of the novel is where the very touching, tragic scene of the pretty quick decline of his grandmother is described. And also another huge plot point would be the initiation of the relationship between the narrator and Albertine, who's going to become a major force in the coming volumes. And they make out in his bedroom, and even that has kind of got some farcical elements to it. They're interrupted, and then eventually they get somewhat intimate with one another, but he kind of says, well, I didn't love her, I don't love her, but he's clearly attracted to her, interested. So, and then there's another scene where later towards the end of the book where he has this confrontation with the Baron de Charles, and who just kind of comes after him. He thinks that the narrator's been bad-mouthing him, and he's just, I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. And this is after, earlier, he says, I want you to, be my protege. I'm going to kind of teach you how to be in society, and you just listen to me and everything. And then after this long dinner party, the narrator shows up at the Baron's house, and then he gets kind of smacked around, and the narrator stands up for himself, and then the Baron kind of cools off and is nice to him, and then actually gives him a ride home in his carriage. So you don't know what's up with this Baron. You're going to find out a lot more what's up with the Baron for real when you get to the next volume, Sodom and Gomorrah. But yeah, there are actually some really great moments in this book, but it's you have to be super patient because there is a lot. I wouldn't call it fluff. I just think there's a lot of detail that you have to wade through. And it's when you read, this is my advice for reading Proust, you have to read them slow but steady, right? You can't read them so slowly that you just give up and put it away for 3 months. you have to kind of keep coming back day after day after day, but read them in smaller doses, but steady doses, and really pay attention to what you're reading. Like let the language soak in, let the description soak in. Okay, so I hope I didn't spoil things too much with the Guermantes Way. I thought this translation by Mark Treharne, I liked it better than the James Grieve translation of In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower. I think this is on par with the first translation, Swan's Way by Lydia Davis. I don't know if there's a need to rank them, but the fact that, because they're translating different volumes, but overall amongst the first three books, there's a pretty good consistency, even though we have different translators. I was worried about that, but there are differences that I'm noticing. And the strength of this was like, it was pretty lucid. I never felt like I got totally bogged down and lost. But let's compare the Mark Treharne to the always classic C.K. Scott Moncrieff translation. And what I've selected is an early passage in the new translation. It's on page 134. And this is one of the foreshadow scenes where we realize that the grandmother is not doing well. I didn't want to read like her deathbed scene, because I think that's something that you should encounter on your own. It's really beautifully written. I'll just put it that way. But this also is beautifully written, but it's kind of gives you a hint of what's to come a little bit later in the book. So just to kind of cut in here, the narrator's been visiting St. Luc on his military camp or base, and he's been called away to go back to Paris. So he says goodbye and so forth. So we'll kind of cut in here, and I think it'll speak for itself. So first I'm going to read the newer translation by Mark Treharne. This passage goes on for about 2 pages. I was heartbroken not to have said goodbye to St. Luc, but I left nevertheless, for my sole concern was to return to my grandmother. Up to this day, in this small town, whenever I thought of what my grandmother was doing on her own, I pictured her as she was when I was with her. But eliminating my own presence and not taking into account the effect upon her of this elimination, now I had to free myself as quickly as possible in her arms from the ghostly image, unsuspected until now, but suddenly evoked by her voice, of a grandmother who was really separated from me. So she had phoned him, just to add that detail, who was really separated from me, resigned, getting on in years, something that had never occurred to me before, and who had just received a letter from me in the empty apartment in which I had already imagined Mama when I had left for Baalbek. Alas, it was this ghostly image that I saw when I entered the drawing room before my grandmother had been informed of my return, and found her there reading. I was there in the room, but in another way I was not there, because she was ignorant of the fact. And like a woman who has been caught unawares at some piece of handiwork that she will hide away if anyone comes in, she was absorbed in thoughts she had always kept hidden in my presence. The only part of myself that was present in that privileged moment which does not last, and in which during the brief space of a return we suddenly find ourselves able to perceive our own absence, was the witness, the observer, in traveling coat and hat, the stranger to the house, the photographer who was called to take a photograph of places that will never be seen again. What my eyes did automatically in the moment I caught sight of my grandmother was to take a photograph. We never see those who are dear to us except in the animated workings, the perpetual motion of our incessant love for them, which before allowing the images their faces represent to reach us, draws them into its vortex, flings them back onto the idea of them we have always had, makes them adhere to it, coincide with it. How since I had interpreted all that was most subtle and permanent in my grandmother's mind from her forehead and her cheeks, How since every habitual glance is necromancy, and every face we love a mirror of the past, how could I have done otherwise than to neglect what had become dulled and changed about her, given that in the most indifferent spectacles of daily life, our eyes, burdened with thought, pay no attention, as classical tragedy pays no attention to any image that does not contribute to the action of the play and limits itself to those that have the power to make its purpose meaningful. But if instead of our eyes it should happen to be a purely material lens, a photographic plate that has been watching things, then what we see in the courtyard of this institute, for example, instead of an academician emerging into the street to hail a cab, will be his tottering attempts to avoid falling on his back, the parabola of his fall, as though he were drunk or the ground covered in ice. Similarly, some cruel trick of chance may prevent the intelligent devotion of our affection from rushing forward in time to hide from our eyes what they ought never to linger upon, and outstripped by chance, they get there first with the field to themselves, and start to function mechanically like photographic film, showing us not the beloved figure who has long ceased to exist, and whose death our affection has never wanted to reveal, but the new person it has clothed, hundreds of times each day, in a lovingly deceptive likeness. And like a sick man who has not looked in a mirror for a long time and who constantly composes the set of the features he never sees in accordance with the ideal image of his face he carries in his mind, then recoils when he catches sight in a mirror of a monumental red nose slanting out of the arid desert of his face like an Egyptian pyramid. I, for whom my grandmother was still myself, I who had only ever seen her with my soul, always at the same point of the past, through the transparency of contiguous and overlapping memories, suddenly, in our drawing room, which had now become part of a new world, the world of time, inhabited by the strangers we describe as aging well, for the first time, and for a mere second, since she vanished almost immediately, I saw, sitting there on the sofa, beneath the lamp, red-faced, heavy, and vulgar, ill, her mind in a daze, the slightly crazed eyes wandering over a brook, a crushed old woman whom I did not know. So that is a long passage, but it gives you a sense of, the power of Proust's writing, the use of metaphors with the photographic film and all that business, and just the intricacy with which he writes. I mean, not everyone's cup of tea. I love it, and just read that deathbed scene that comes 100, 200 pages later and try not to cry. I mean, it's probably in my top two favorite well-written death scenes. It's hard to rival the death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, but this rivals it. This is up there. It ranks. Okay. Let's compare that passage I just read with the older translation, the classic translation by C.K. Scott Moncrieff. Here we go. I was wretched at not having said goodbye to Saint Loup, but I went nevertheless, for my one anxiety was to return to my grandmother. Always until then, in this little country town, when I thought of what my grandmother must be doing by herself, I had pictured her as she was when with me, suppressing my own personality, but without taking into account the effects of such a suppression. Now, I had to free myself, at the first possible moment in her arms, from the phantom, hitherto unsuspected and suddenly called into being by her voice, of a grandmother really separated from me, resigned, having what I had never yet thought of her as having, a definite age, who had just received a letter from me in an empty house, as I had once before imagined Mama in a house by herself, when I had left her to go to Baalbek. Alas, this phantom was just what I did see when entering the drawing room before my grandmother had been told of my return. I found her there reading. I was in the room, or rather, I was not yet in the room since she was not aware of my presence. And like a woman whom one surprises at a piece of work which she will lay aside if anyone comes in, she had abandoned herself to a train of thoughts which she had never allowed to be visible by me. Of myself, thanks to that privilege which does not last, but which one enjoys during the brief moment of return, the faculty of being a spectator, so to speak, of one's own absence, there was present only the witness, the observer with a hat and traveling coat, the stranger who does not belong to the house, the photographer who is called to take a photograph of places which one will never see again. The process that mechanically occurred in my eyes when I caught sight of my grandmother was indeed a photograph. We never see the people who are dear to us save in the animated system, the perpetual motion of our incessant love for them, which before allowing the images that their faces present to reach us, catches them in its vortex, flings them back upon the idea that we have always had of them, makes them adhere to it, coincide with it. How, since into the forehead, the cheeks of my grandmother, I had been accustomed to read all the most delicate, the most permanent qualities of her mind. How, since every casual glance is an act of necromancy, each face that we love a mirror of the past, how could I have failed to overlook what in her had become dulled and changed? Seeing that in the most trivial spectacles of our daily life, our eye, charged with thought, neglects, as would a classical tragedy, every image that does not assist the action of the play, and retains only those that may help to make its purpose intelligible. But if, in place of our eye, it should be a purely material object, a photographic plate that has watched the action, then what we shall see in the courtyard of the Institute, for example, will be, instead of the dignified emergence of an academician who is going to hail a cab, his staggering gait, his precautions to avoid tumbling upon his back, the parabola of his fall, as though he were drunk or the ground frozen over. So it is when some casual sport of chance prevents our intelligent and pious affection from coming forward in time to hide from our eyes what they ought never to behold, when it is forestalled by our eyes, and they, arising first in the field, and having it to themselves, set to work mechanically, like films, and shew us, in place of the loved friend who has long ago ceased to exist, but whose death our affection has always hitherto kept concealed from us, the new person, whom 100 times daily that affection has clothed with a dear and cheating likeness. And, as a sick man who, for long, has not looked at his own reflection, and has kept his memory of the face that he never sees refreshed from the ideal image of himself that he carries in his mind, recoils on catching sight in the glass, in the midst of an arid waste of cheek, of the sloping red structure of a nose as huge as one of the pyramids of Egypt. I, for whom my grandmother was still myself, I who had never seen her save in my own soul, always at the same place in the past, through the transparent sheets of contiguous, overlapping memories, suddenly in our drawing room, which formed part of a new world, that of time, that in which dwell the strangers, of whom we say, he's begun to age a good deal. For the first time, and for a moment only, since she vanished at once, I saw, sitting on the sofa beneath the lamp, red-faced, heavy and common, sick, lost in thought, following the lines of a book with eyes that seemed hardly sane, a dejected old woman whom I did not know. It's a very sad scene, but I think, so many of us can identify with that. You visit a relative, aging relative you haven't seen, and they've declined, and you sort of that shock of recognition really, really slams you. What beautiful writing. Which translation do you like better? I like both, but I think I like the C.K. Scott Moncrieff. It feels a little smoother. but I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments if you have a preference. What else? Another thing in the introduction to this volume that I really appreciated was they pointed out there's kind of a theme of theatricality, a motif that is laced through the Guermantes Way. And once they called my attention to that, it really popped out. You even hear it in that passage I just read. But everyone's putting on a show, and that's definitely a thread that runs through the whole book. And it helped me to kind of stick with the book, and it made it more coherent for me. So yeah, good introduction, good notes, a very good translation, I think, an improvement on volume 2 in my humble opinion. And now we move on to Sodom and Gomorrah. I've already launched into this, 70 pages in, and this is where the novel takes a brand new turn. I won't spoil it for you. We'll get to it another day after I finish it. Anyway, that's my Proust update. I'm marching on. I'm hopefully going to finish the whole darn thing. I don't know. I'd like to finish it by the end of summer. We'll see. So probably end of summer, early fall. I should have gotten through the whole thing. And it's been just a real joyride for me, I have to say. I really like reading Proust in this fashion. I recommend it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about the Guermantes Way. Did you have the same kind of troubles reading it that I did? What are some of your favorite scenes in the book? And what do you think about the two different translators? Yeah, it should be fun to get the conversation going there. Thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you again, I hope, real soon. Bye-bye.